Happy Tuesday, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Is Finance Ready for AI? Assessing the risks and rewards of adopting AI for finance teams. As we wait for everyone to join over the next few minutes, please feel free to chat in the Zoom interface and share where you're joining from. I'm Devin Clark. I'm Centime's Director of Demand Generation, and today I'm joining you from the Berkshires of Massachusetts. So, before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. So we are recording. If you're curious to go back and rewatch this session, you'll have it on demand recording, and we'll send that to you via email. Please engage with the polls. It gives our speakers an understanding of who you are, and it really helps guide the conversation. Additionally, if you have signed up through CPA Academy, you are required to answer the poll questions to earn credit, so don't forget to do that. And we are on chat and Q&A, so please, I encourage you to mingle in the chat, submit any questions you may have for our speakers today through the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer questions in real time or at the end of the session. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce you to a great panel for today's roundtable discussion. We have BC Krishna, CEO and founder of Centime, Leon Gordon, CEO and founder of Onyx Data, and Steve Rosveld, founder of CFO.University. BC, would you mind kicking us off and sharing a little bit about yourself? And then Leon and Steve, would you kindly do the same?
Of course. Hi, Devin. Thank you so much. I wish I was in the Berkshires as well. I just happened to be in my office. And hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday as well. My name is BC Krishna. I'm the founder and CEO of Centime. I started the company 3 years ago, and I've spent the last 15 years or so as a founder and CEO of various fintech companies. Most recently, prior to this, I started a company called Mineral Tree, which was an accounts payable automation company. I'm so glad to be here. My goal and role, I guess, today is to be the crafty curmudgeon, try to balance the excitement of AI with the realities of it. And I'm sure that my co-panelists will do the same as well. Over to you, Leon and Steve.
Excellent. Thank you, BC. And it's a pleasure to be here, everybody, today. As BC mentioned, my name is Leon Gordon. I'm the CEO and founder of Onyx Data, a data analytics and AI consultancy based out of the UK. I've been in and around the data analytics and AI space for just over the last decade or so now. I regularly contribute to Forbes as a thought leader in the space, and I'm also one of 29 Microsoft Data Platform MVPs based out of the UK. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today.
And I'm Steve Rosevald. I run CFO.University, a training platform and professional development platform for CFOs and finance leaders. My background comes all through the finance ranks. I started with 2 large multinational companies for 22 years and learned my finance and accounting from those companies, and then started a CFO advisory practice about 15 years ago. And then did that for almost 10 years when I said, hey, I think we have something to teach here. And so we started CFO.University back in 2017, and I live in Vancouver, Washington.
Thank you all. I appreciate you being here with us today. So let me just give a quick preview of what we'll discuss today, and then we can get into the meat of the content. BC is going to get us started with some insights into really why we're here and level the playing field for the audience of just defining what AI is. We'll dive into some of the risks and benefits of AI, how to get started, and our experts will share their predictions for the future of AI. So BC, I'm going to hand the mic over to you. While we're transitioning, I'm also going to launch our first of 2 polls that we have. There's a few questions within this, so please feel free to answer throughout this entire next section.
All right. So shall I just dive in, Devin? Is that okay?
Please.
Or should I wait for the poll to complete, or what's the...
We're going to give people plenty of time.
What's the etiquette here? Help me. Never done this before.
We'll give people the entire section to answer the poll, so please feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to take the next 10 to 15 minutes just really setting the stage. The term AI has, in the last, certainly since November of last year, and in the last 5 years or so, has become very much of a common word in everyday, party talk. My grandmother wants to know what AI is. But it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And if we're going to have a meaningful conversation about how finance can benefit from AI, I think it's helpful and useful to just really put some guardrails around what we mean by AI. And what I wanted to do is to provide some context for the evolution, but also get to the point where we frame AI in contemporary terms, especially in the context of what ChatGPT and GPT have done to us, in the last several months. So please bear with me while I take us through this. So the question, of course, that we want to ask today is finance ready for AI? And I'll posit to you that AI has been around for a while, and finance has been using AI in many different ways for a while as well. The operative question, I think, for us today is finance ready for generative AI, which is the type of AI that ChatGPT represents? So I'm going to get to that in a second, but as I said, I want to go back to the beginning, and we were sort of talking about first principles, right? Ab initio. Let's get to the basics. Let's get to the definition, a commonly understood meaning of the word AI, right? I mean, McKinsey, other people have had this kind of definition, but the general idea is that AI is a machine's ability to perform cognitive functions that we normally associate with the human mind. There are many things, of course, that we associate with the human mind. The idea of having a computer act like it's a human being is the essence of what AI is. And it's the essence of what Alan Turing back in 1950 called the Turing test. More on that in a second. But this sort of quest, right, of imbuing computers with human cognitive functions is a romantic quest, right? I mean, H.G. Wells talks about it in The War of the Worlds, right? The Martians came in big machines that were intelligent. There are a few different cognitive functions that we have as human beings: curiosity, consciousness, and creativity, that weirdly also drive our desire to imbue machines with intelligence. And so that's why I think this kind of Mobius strip represents that. What is the relationship with machines? Is there an intelligent machine, or is there an intelligent human? And what is the relationship between the intelligent human wanting to create an intelligent machine, which turns around and pretends like it's an intelligent human? So it's kind of this weird sort of interaction between, the human mind and the computer that really ultimately drives us towards this notion of artificial intelligence. Of course, there's some practical elements of it, which is that, hey, it has to ultimately serve humankind in some way, productivity, and so on and so forth, new insights. But I thought that with that as a backdrop, I would spend the next 2 minutes just really taking us through about 15, 16 events in the last 75 years that have brought us to this point that represents an evolution of AI. Please bear with me. This is a very busy slide. I'll walk us through this. 1950, Alan Turing, one of the most famous computer scientists of all time, proposes what he calls the Turing test. And the idea of the Turing test is that if a machine can trick a human being into believing that it is a human being, then it is considered intelligent. That's the essence of the Turing test. Now, of course, that's one definition of intelligence. It doesn't cover things like, consciousness and so on and so forth. But the test at hand, if you can kind of pretend, or the machine can trick the human being, the human observer, into believing that it's a human being, then it's considered passing the Turing test. John McCarthy, another famous computer scientist, coins the term artificial intelligence. Some of you may be familiar with, in 1964, the first sort of chatbot, used to be called chatterbots back in the day, developed a computer program called ELIZA, which pretended to be a Rogerian psychologist. And it's remarkable, if you go back to the kinds of interaction and dialogue that were happening with ELIZA, how realistic it is. There was a general purpose mobile robot that was developed. IBM Deep Blue, more contemporary times, from 1966 to 1997, was what some people call the winter of AI. There's a number of different initiatives that were tried that failed. Didn't stop people from trying. There were many, many, many things that were done in those days, but they weren't really successful. But the big blast in 1997 was when IBM mainframes were programmed to defeat Garry Kasparov. It was an amazing moment, if you really think about it. And it is relatively recent, only 23 years ago, 25 years ago. But in 1999 is what I would consider to be the beginning of a new wave. It's the consumerization of AI. Sony launched a pet dog. Not sure, it wasn't necessarily successful, but it captured people's imagination even more so. And it's sort of the first time it really brought AI into the consumer world, into the consumer domain. It's where, again, like I said, my grandmother started to ask questions about what is this thing that we call AI? Roomba, household name now. Siri, household name. We all heard about like Watson defeating the human competition on Jeopardy. Some of you are not familiar with like Eugene Goostman, and I put this in here because it was the first time in 65 years that a computer actually passed the Turing test. There was a panel of human beings that interacted with Eugene, and Eugene successfully tricked this panel of human beings into believing that it was a human. There's a number of other initiatives that happened between 2014 and 2016, sort of rapid progress, computers, data, better models, huge amount of advances. But to me, one of the key things that has happened in the last several years is in 2017, there's several scientists from Google published a new architecture that's called the transformer architecture. Simplistically, I mean, by the way, this stuff is incredibly complicated, huge amounts of math, very, very difficult to sort of really grok. But the summary here is that the transformer architecture was a breakthrough because what it did was it allowed people to train machines in parallel with very, very, very large data sets. In a minute, you'll see that artificial intelligence really depends upon imbuing computers with data that can then be used to create inferences. Now, the more data you have, the better that language models are, the better intelligence is represented within the computer. But the transformer architecture really made it easy for very large amounts of data to be fed into computers in parallel to make that the underlying knowledge representations to be very robust, which is really what directly led to ChatGPT. GPT, of course, stands, the T in GPT stands for transformer. And of course, that's sort of the next step towards the consumerization of AI. So this is where we are. But what I wanted to do is to step back for a second and share with you the core model, right? The core model, whether you're looking at GPT or any other AI-based approach, it starts with training data that is then fed to a computer that uses some kind of a learning model that then uses that learning model to represent that data. Human beings do this as well, right? So imagine that I now was able to provide the computer with two things, something red and something black. And I said to the computer, all red things are good and all blue things are bad, right? So I just say that those are the two things that I sort of, fed the model with. Now, the computer now represents red equals good, blue equals bad. And now subsequently, if I ask the question of, hey, here's something blue, tell me if it's good or bad, the computer can then respond with the answer. Now, very simplistic, very inappropriate in some ways, but the point I want to make is that it's as simple as that at some level. Take data, train the computer, represent the knowledge, and then use some kind of an inference model to produce results. There's no difference between that and what happens within GPT. But I'll talk about that in a minute. But the point is that because this model has been prevalent in a very long time, AI actually has been applied in finance for a very, very long time in various types of financial operations, in trading, in risk management, document analysis, in benchmarking. We don't have the time to go into all of these examples, but to ask the question of is finance ready for AI? Of course, has been ready for a long time and has been a consumer of AI applications for a very long time. But the reoperative question is finance ready for generative AI? So we'll talk about that, right? But first, a minute on how does this model apply to GPT? Of course, as you know, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. So you start with lots of training data. In this particular case, a massive amount of training data, 570 gigabytes, about $100 million. The people estimate that OpenAI spent something like $100 million in expenses to train the computers, and then huge amounts of processing power that went into it. That training data has to be tagged in some way. That's what supervised learning is. And then the computer has to be, taught that the inferences that it draws are correct or incorrect through a reward mechanism, which is what is called reinforced learning. And ultimately, all of that is then represented as what's called a neural network, especially a special kind of neural network, which is the transformer. And underlying that is what some people also call the large language model. Language doesn't literally mean language. Language simply means that it can take a set of input tokens and produce a set of output tokens. And that's really what you experience every day. So these GPT models take as input natural language inputs, right? Hey, tell me about myself, or tell me about yourself, or what's the weather going to be tomorrow? And based on the data that it has, it then produces this magical output, which clearly beats the Turing test many times over in the form of what sort of people call generative AI. That's the essence of it. And I'll just sort of say one or two things before I turn it over to the rest of the group. It is transformative. It's magical. It can do so many things, so well. Text classification, Q&A, summarization, language translation. These are all things that I think many of you have already experienced. What we should be concerned about also, not to sound like a wet blanket here, but the point is that there are some things. Every model has limitations, and similarly, GPT has limitations. It has no memory. Your interactions do not translate into new learning. If you ask it a question, it doesn't mean that it remembers that question and uses it with somebody else. If you provide answers yourself, it doesn't mean that translates into new learning. All learning is the result of training. How should I interpret the results that you're getting? Yeah, it sounds logical, but when you're getting into certain areas which might be a little bit more arcane, it's difficult for these kinds of models to explain why it came up with the answer. And then finally, something that should be a concern is that when these models train on data that inherently has bias, right? And people have talked about this bias relating to sexism, racism, things that we abhor in society. Often what happens is that those biases are often reflected in the results that we get. Finally, I'll say that learning is the result of training. GPT models that are not trained in a certain domain obviously cannot answer questions about that domain. They may be able to answer general questions, but they might not be able to answer specific questions, right? There are domain-specific engines that are needed in order to have these kinds of models do the right thing. An example is BioGPT, which is a model that is built using biomedical tasks that has demonstrated its ability to be more accurate and better and produce better results than the general purpose ChatGPT that we're all familiar with. Yesterday, OpenAI announced that they were going to create something called ChatGPT Enterprise, which then enterprises like many of you work in can feed training data into the model that's proprietary to you, that becomes contained within a sandbox that is specific to you, that the model trains on and produces results that are specific to you. So it's very important to understand that the results, as magical as they seem today, are largely the result of extremely rich data that is used to train. So one final thing, and I'll turn it over to the group. So the rhetorical question is finance ready for generative AI? And I think these 4 or 5 or 6 questions are what I think we're going to get into in the next 45 minutes. Does the existing general language model work for specialized finance tasks? Today's ChatGPT is completely based on generalized data, as I said. Who will build a finance-specific language model? Is there something called, accounting GPT, right? What can we do that could not be done before? This is a very important question, right? There are many things that we can do as human beings. We can do that very tediously, but can we do them better? Can we do them faster? What are the specific domains that models like this can help us with? Can we explain the results, right? Take the extreme here. I produce something and I present it to my board, to my investors, to the public markets. You don't want to look stupid if you can't explain the results. Can we trust the results? These are also questions that come up. So these are 6 or 7 questions that I think that we have trusted different AI models before. We use them. They're broadly prevalent today. As we move into this kind of world of generative AI, I think it's important for us to sort of ask these questions, get comfortable with the answers as we proceed to the next step.
Thank you, BC. And I just want to share some poll responses and mainly just focus on that last question that we asked around whether you're using AI in your finance processes today. It seems about 16% are, and then the majority, 21%, are thinking about considering adoption in 12 months, and then 34% in the next 1 to 5 years, and then 30% have not been considering it at all currently. So I do think it may be interesting to showcase some of the results that we've seen currently. So let me share my screen. All right. So you can see here a little bit of a sneak peek of some data. Recently, we did an AI survey where we uncovered statistics from 400 plus finance directors and above about AI. So in this first chart, you can see a breakdown of industries who are adopting AI today, with nearly 80% of respondents that are currently adopting AI in industries like technology and financial services, compared to industries that have less adoption. You can see below that 20% line for industries like agriculture, nonprofits, healthcare, and services. So Steve, Leon, I'm curious if you have any initial reactions to some of these responses.
Well, I'll just quickly kick off that I come from an ag background, so I'm a little embarrassed to see where we fit on that. But I just had a talk with a gentleman from Cargill, a big agricultural company, and I know they're using a lot of AI. So they maybe aren't represented in this very much, but it makes a lot of sense that technology, financial services, you think about AI and really automation and all that. You know, the financial services have been always way ahead in that area, whether it's from cash management, trading, and things like that. So that makes a lot of sense. From us, I think, you know, education is where I fit in. I'm kind of right in the middle, and I can see where we're using it, you know, not only in the finance side and for accounting, but also in running our business practices in ways that, you know, we wouldn't have thought of even 12 months ago. So.
Excellent. I think from my perspective, it's really looking at this from the perspective of competition. Now that we're seeing adoption across these industries, my mind directly goes towards the competitors that aren't using AI's technology and how far they're potentially falling behind the curve. But it's great to see. It's great to see this adoption across industries, definitely.
BC, any thoughts here?
You know, I feel like I should quit my job and start a farm so that I can go to the bottom left and renounce technology altogether.
It would be interesting, BC, just on that note, to see how long agriculture remains in that shape for. So we do have, and we have been led to believe there are quite a few use cases for AI adoption within the agricultural industry. So that stat there is quite surprising, and it would be very interesting to come back in 3 months, 6 months, or a year to understand if there's any movement on that.
You know, and you know, all of these things are, you know, polls like this, of course, you know, you'd want to dig into in a little bit more detail, right? You know, what is agriculture exactly? You know, Steve, you brought up the point about Cargill, right? You know, it's an agri-business, but it's really a chemical manufacturer. And so it's hard to say, you know, so exactly what do you classify yourself as? You know, and there are many different types of agribusinesses, of course, right? Is John Deere an agribusiness? I mean, you know, so I think that, you know, when you get into it in a little bit more detail, it's probably, you know, a little bit more nuanced than simply relegating, you know, agriculture to the stereotype, you know, that, you know, this chart seems to indicate that it is.
Another surprising area, I think, is the medical field. I'm surprised how far healthcare and medical, and that might be because the confidentiality and things
confidentiality,
like that.
regulation, you know, those kinds of things really do play a role. Plus, it's also like, you know, the fact that, you know, what we mentioned, right? It's a very specific domain, you know, and, you know, you kind of get into those areas sometimes, like, you know, you kind of, again, context, I think, is important. General questions like this might get very general answers.
And just one more chart, if you guys don't mind. So I have also from this survey that we did, some sentiment around introducing AI into finance processes. And this green you can see are in support of it. It's an overwhelming amount of 75% compared to the 16% that are right now currently opposed, compared to the 9% that really haven't thought about it at all. Any thoughts on this at all?
I look at that as, I think there's this tentative, the largest chunk is that somewhat supportive. And I think that's this tentative, we have this big hope that this is the next, and we can see improvements being made, but there's also in the back of your mind, those risks of what AI brings. And, all those things, we'll talk about them a little bit later, but there's a lot of risk there, and people, it's moving so quickly. I think that can be scary to people. And I think that's why somewhat supportive rather than very supportive. And then on the risk side, there's the completely opposed people. I can see where they're coming from, is that I don't know what the end game is here. Where does it end up? And I think that scares people, including finance people, for sure.
I agree, and I think with these type of figures, a lot of it comes down to education. So BC touched on this at the beginning of the session and really walked through what generative AI looks like today. A lot of organizations don't understand this, and like I say, Steve, from your perspective as well, being in the education sector, I think that walking leaders through this journey in terms of, okay, what is generative AI? How can we adopt it? Is it safe to adopt? Some of the questions that are coming through in the chat at the moment are based around security. Obviously, with financial data, we understand that there's a large degree that needs to be discussed from a security perspective. So I think that some of these, some of the figures being brought back to us today in terms of being opposed are more than likely down to the education aspect of it, as opposed to actually the underlying technology.
Yeah, and I think context is important. What's the application? Let's get more specific in exactly what are we going to do with it, right? And I suspect that if you asked a question like this in the 1970s, I would like to introduce computers into financial processes, you might have gotten a similar response, right? Which is like 42% saying like I'm supposed to, so I'm supportive, and 33% saying I'm somewhat supportive, right? Because what's the purpose? How do I, and that's really the essence of what we're trying to do on this panel. What is it going to be used for? Let's get some specific, let's get to the use cases that, as promising as this is, if we don't show people every day how they're going to use these solutions to make their lives better, to go home early, sleep well at night, there's not much point.
Yeah, agree. And BC, I'm going to stop sharing now. I think that's a great introduction for kind of the next few sections that we're going to walk through. In the meantime, I am going to launch our last poll for the day. So hold on one moment. I'm going to stop sharing the next one and launching some questions around benefits and concerns about AI. So please feel free to answer that in the meantime. To get us started, Steve, I know in an article that you published on CFO.University for chief financial officers, a practical approach to using artificial intelligence, you shared that a survey, I think it was by KPMG, found that CEOs believe CFOs are spending a significant time on financial reporting as well as compliance and regulatory issues, instead of really helping them understand and address business challenges that they're facing. How do you see AI closing this gap?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why CFOs around the world think, AI is manna from heaven, because they're so wrapped up in the daily operations of their business and closing the books and getting invoices created and paid and washing their cash flow and things like that, that they don't get the chance, many of them don't get the chance to really be strategic. And so that's what the CEOs are asking. They want a strategic CFO who can help them build the business, grow the business, not just, reduce costs, but also increase revenue and be a real partner to the CEO. And that's hard to do when you're struggling with the mundane and very important, but mundane part of the job, which is getting good books and records in place that people have confidence in. And I think that's where AI is really shaping us to be more efficient. So I look at AI and being, operationally, it has improvements. So we're going to use AI for an improvement as an improvement mechanism. And as BC had said, that's, it's speed, it's accuracy, it's volume, being able to handle more volume. So whether that's in closing the books quicker, or whether that's getting payments out quicker, collections, whatever, all those processes can be efficient. But there's also a really more important part of that. So that's, I'd call that the accounting aspect and maybe some of the treasury aspect, being able to do those functions, whether it's procure to pay or order to cash or store to ship. All those processes that we have can be much more efficient. That's good. But what's really interesting on the finance side is being able to use the forecasting piece and being able to grow our ability to do better work on what is going to impact our future. And I think that's where some of these technologies, we're really looking for help in that area, which is what the CFOs want to do and what the CEOs want them to do. So there's a good, right now, it looks like a pretty good marriage. I know BC might have his question marks on it, but for finance people, there's so many potential applications, and it's just a matter of, where we start.
I feel like I need to defend myself or something, Yeah. No, I mean, I just look, I think that there's tremendous promise. I think to me, like, it comes back to some level to one thing, right? Which is, what are we doing today that we can do better? What is the cost of applying the new technologies, and is it worth it? Right. Again, I'm not trying to be negative. I think I'm just being practical and saying, like, there's just tremendous promise. We just have to make sure, like, forecasting is a great example. Nobody forecasts well, right? It's really complicated. And, to do that better, there's great promise. We built a forecasting component into our product, which uses historical data from the general ledger to make that happen. Can we do it better? Absolutely. I believe we do a good job, but it always can be better. That last 10, 20, 30%, which is sort of, really important, can be enabled through technologies like, generative AI.
Well, the last thing I'll say in it, that there's three, that speed, accuracy, and volume are good. That's all the efficiency. There's the big question mark, and I think BC, this is maybe where it gets to be. We don't know what the cost to train the AI is. That's the piece that's really fuzzy. We think it's all free right now because you go into, Chat GPT and it's all free. Well, that's not really training yet, right? So as we train our own individual, AI, what is the cost to do that well? And what's the cost if we don't well? So that may be the big risk that we're kind of missing.
I think so. See, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, Leon. I just want to share two things, right? One is that Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, talks about this. He said, like, it costs them a few pennies per chat. It's free to us, not free to them. They're building an audience. They're creating a market. They're willing to invest think about it, right? 100 million people and a few pennies per chat is not free to them. Number one. Number two is that everybody's seen NVIDIA's results. If you haven't, you should, right? This is now a $1 trillion company, and NVIDIA's chips are the go-to infrastructure that's being used to train these models. There's a shortage of chips, and that shortage of chips is further increasing the cost of training. All of this, as negative as it sounds, it's not negative. It's all good. It all means that there's great promise and great outcomes that can come once we sort of clear the backlog of, the supply chain problems in this industry.
Yeah, agreed. And just to touch base in terms of general applications from an enterprise perspective, when we work with organizations, we do look at using pricing calculators that can be fairly accurate in terms of building out these type of machine learning models, the amount of data to be processed, whether it's actually real time or historic data. So we can get fairly accurate pricing in terms of what it costs an organization to build out these models. Now, in terms of our approach, we tend to tag this alongside business value, especially looking at what the organization's goals are for this year. So is it okay? We want to grow our net profits by 10%, for example. We want to become more cost effective. We want to cut costs in this scenario. By then twinning I won't call it a proof of concept, let's call it a project, for lack of a better term, with the end business value, it means it becomes tangible. We can measure the adoption, the success, and the value that it brings to the organization. But also, you can then put in place a budget for this type of solution. Way too often, and I won't go too far off on a tangent on this one, but way too often what we see is organizations going haywire, for lack of a better term, with AI, and just trying to put plasters over solutions that potentially don't need solutioning using this type of technology. So really, it's about twinning that use case with business value and being able to measure that.
Thank you, Leon. Thinking about, okay, so we've talked a little bit about the benefits, but around risk when it comes to AI. Leon, I know you recently published the 5 common pitfalls to avoid when implementing AI, a guide for executives, in which you highlighted poorly defined objectives, insufficient data, lack of accountability, absence of human expertise, and then regulatory compliance. Do you mind if you can share a few more of those insights that finance leaders really need to assess when it comes to each of these pitfalls, or what you, I think, often call ignored minefields?
Yes, indeed. And I think you're referring to the Forbes article there, which is, like I say, one of my most recent articles on the subject. I just alluded to it slightly in my previous commentary as well. And it's really about avoiding what we become, the projects that never see the light of day, for example. Now, for us as consultants, we're very aware of these type of projects and keen to avoid them. And this is where organizations are just throwing money at a project doesn't actually ever come to fruition. It remains a POC, it remains in development, and it doesn't have enough business value alongside it for there to be much of a push inside the organization. Now, I would say this is one of the common pitfalls to avoid, and that is the project never realizing completion. Now, it's also keen to ensure that you have stakeholder involvement and engagement across the organization for these type of scenarios. All too often, we partner with organizations who, for example, have the CEO or the CFO, in this instance, on board for the project, but ultimately there's not buy-in across the whole organization in terms of what we're striving to achieve with this type of project. Now, what that means is that whilst we have a stakeholder who is very optimistic, very enthusiastic about the deliverable, it means that we don't actually get a great response across the organization, because as we all know, everybody becomes very busy in their day-to-day lives, and without understanding the value behind these type of technologies, like BC alluded to earlier, and I believe Steve touched on this as well, it's about really putting in place, okay, what are we going to use this technology for? Okay, how is that going to serve us as an organization? Which metric is it going to change for us? And then also, as we're all aware, we ask the 5 whys after this. Why? Ultimately, at the end of this, we come back with a use case. Okay, now, again, to avoid the pitfall of going full steam ahead with this, let's put together a POC. Okay, what data do we need? What's the quality of that data? Can we enrich and enhance that data? Okay, excellent. Now we have our data sources. Who can this serve in the organization? Stakeholder engagement, interviews, and ensuring that everybody has a seat at the table, again, is a very common pitfall to avoid. Ensuring that everybody's voice is heard across the organization with these type of projects and integrations means that you leave no stone unturned. Now, we agree that a pitfall to avoid as well is user acceptance testing. Now, once you have a solution in place, okay, let's iterate over it. Is it answering the questions that we need? Can it be more robust? Can it be more readily available alongside the organization? Now, without dwelling on this too much, the approach that we find works best is going from, like I say, this really business value driven conversation to begin with, and then ultimately always pointing back towards that. Now, we know that executives are very driven towards the end goals from a business perspective. So if the project is aligning directly to a positive outcome of that metric or value, then you can ensure buy-in across the whole organization from that perspective. So that would be my number one pitfall to avoid, is have that very clear roadmap and definition once you begin these type of implementations.
Thanks, Leon. Now, I know we're only around 20 minutes left, so let's get started into our third section, which is how does somebody get started? What are some of the quick wins of use cases that you all would recommend for the finance leaders that are joining us today?
You know, I can give a couple of examples. Last week in our member meeting, one of our members said they're a big contractor. And they said, you know, we used to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what it would take. They had a case of 1,000 workers that were going to be on site for a year. They made us, and they used, you know, I think it was ChatGPT to kind of say, what does it cost to feed and supply 1,000 workers that are going to be on site? And they and so as a quick question, and they got a pretty quick answer. And they had done some work on this before, and they kind of compared to that. We're going to say, boy, it's awfully close. So that was one example that was really easy for them to say, we can adopt it for things like ancillary parts of our budget, when we're contracting. So that's one example. Another example, and this is a case I think BC you'd mentioned, there is a chat called Chat CFO, and it's from a company called Sturpey, I think, out of Colorado. And they had the examples they use. So they promote themselves as a 24/7 interim CFO that's a chat. And they use the example.
Is there an actual human being behind it, or is that really a technology?
There is a real human being behind it, but I haven't been that involved with it. But
I think we should. I would call these people out. Chat CFO sounds awfully suspicious.
Chat CFO sounds yeah, great marketing, right? Great marketing. But what they had done is, one of the examples they used is, hey, we want to hire a financial analyst. What should we expect to get? And so what they use is they load financials into the model, so you're getting your own financials, so kind of more specific than just chat. And I haven't used it, so I can't. I'm not endorsing anything. I'm just saying that they're looking at using these use cases where people ask a question that you would have taken a financial analyst weeks or months to put together before, and you can get some pretty good results. And at least it gives you a parallel runway. So for a while we can use this as parallel. We're still doing our own work, but we're also getting comfortable with what AI can do for us. And so it may not really save you much time initially, but you learn what things it does well and what things it doesn't. And that's what I'm finding, all kinds of different ideas from CFOs on that. The struggle that they're having is finding out what Leanne had alluded to. How do we strategically implement this within our business model? That's we can do a lot of one-off stuff, but how do we strategic? And that's the issue people are facing.
If I can weigh in here, I think there are two approaches that one can take, right? Leon alluded to this. I can take this sort of, I need to be very strategic about this. I see these as potential uses and outcomes. We have brainstormed some approaches here. And what I want to do is to build my own generative AI model that uses my data, my context, and my business case and my use case to implement something. And that might be ultimately where every organization needs to go, right? But it's a long road to get there. And you made a very good point, Steve, is that there are some quick wins I think that businesses can have, like right now, right here, to get very comfortable with the idea of what it can do for you. You can actually go and sign up for ChatGPT and, ask some very general questions that are perfectly answered because of this large language model that they have. And I think about 4 or 5 areas where how-to questions are so easy to ask, right? I think about audit, control, risk, operational processes, everyday things that every finance professional needs to have answers for. And some of them, you clearly may know, but what's contemporary, right? This is what I knew before. Is this how it's done today? What is the current way of doing things? These are sort of very, very simple questions that I think can be answered and sort of obtained. And it's a great way to get experience with the model. Right? Audit, control, risk, basic operational how often do we use, for example, segregation of duties, it's like sounds stupid, but I think it's something that, people should ask, right? If it's a small organization that might not have implemented it, what are the control weaknesses that can be mitigated by something like that? So any number of these questions, and again, as the saying goes, no question is a dumb question. And these models exist to help you. And it's a great way to immerse yourself and get some answers. Before you take that sort of strategic imperative to say, you know what, now I'm going to invest the sort of $1 million that I need to invest in order to create a big strategic advantage for me.
Great points. Yep.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that what you're describing there, BC, just if I'm clear in this, is more of the co-pilot approach. So the way that I look at this in terms of day-to-day is if I'm developing, I don't have to go to GitHub or Stack Overflow anymore. I have my co-developer, so to speak, next to me that I can ask for these little code snippets to review my code, etc. It sounds very similar to having what I call either a co-pilot or a virtual assistant there that you're referring to in that type of approach.
Yep, exactly correct. Yep. And again, some people, just looking at the Q&A, I think people are certainly correctly asking questions about confidentiality, how accurate is the information, and so on and so forth. As long as your expectations are clear, right? As we said, this is data. The answers that you get from something like ChatGPT is based on a very large training set. Because it's such a large training set, some of the inaccuracies are normally weeded out. Some of the ways in which they train the data, human-assisted training, the reward system that goes into the training actually weeds out some of the errors that you might normally get. There are still going to be biases. There are still going to be some questions that you have. As long as you go into this with an expectation that, is generally correct, you should be okay. Nobody's going to vouch for the fact that it's going to stand up in a court of law. But by and large, I think you should expect that because of the size of the data set, because of the sophistication of the training, generally speaking, we're in the right place.
And I think without laboring the point as well, that it brings us full circle back around to the education piece. Because when adopting a lot of in day-to-day, obviously, like you mentioned, AI, and people don't actually refer to it as generative outside of technical people, in day-to-day life from the conversations I've been having. But everybody is referring to AI, as Steve alluded to earlier, as wizardry. This monitor, I can use it, it's going to give me the correct answer to everything, and I can make myself more efficient in my job by doing so. And I think that what's really missing at the crux of it, regardless of how you move forward with AI implementations, is firmly that education piece, understanding what can be done with it, how can I use it, how accurate are the answers, should I check what's being given back to me before then submitting. And I think that's really key to try to point out here.
I mean, we are schooled as a society to do things like, getting a second opinion on a doctor's diagnosis, right? I mean, forget about AI. If we are, it's just good practice, not to say that you're going to, distrust what your doctor tells you, but, humans are fallible, just like computers are fallible. And we operate based on the data sets that we are trained in. We are operating based on our own biases. Whether or not I woke up with the right side of the bed in the morning. These are questions that I think that we all have about our own interactions. They're no different when it comes to computers.
I agree.
Thank you. I appreciate that dialogue. So to kind of wrap us up, we have about 13 minutes left, and I think everyone here would love to have a better understanding of beyond 2023, what are some of these future predictions that you may have for AI? You can be as bold as you want to be.
Who do you want to start with, Devin?
Steve, why don't you start for us?
Well, we're very excited. The finance function is very excited about AI, maybe too much so. Maybe we haven't thought about the risks enough, but you look at all the applications. So, how we teach the CFO role is accounting, finance, and treasury. And accounting has all kinds of processes in place and internal controls, as BC and Leon had alluded to, that we can apply this generative AI to and improve our cost structures, improve our efficiencies, get quicker and faster, all those things. And that would be both in our accounting and in the funding side, the treasury side of our business, where we're using cash management. So we can use all this operational improvements and save people a lot of work. Now, the risk in there is we still have to be, customer centric and employee aware. So that scares employees, right? So I think one of the big challenges will be, how do we make sure we're bringing the workforce along and making sure that they're comfortable that the direction we're going is good for them too. So I think that's exciting. And then when you get on the finance part, that's all the predictive and that's all the forecasting. And if we can get better at that and help us make better decisions that are, not 3 months out, but 12 months out or 3 years out, if we can get better at that, we're just going to be better businesses. And an example of that might be where you're doing capital spending. So we have a project and everyone has to go through their ROI and say, yeah, we're going to spend this money. But what frequently doesn't happen is they're not able to peel back, was that actually successful? It was a machine in a facility. How do we measure whether that was successful? And that's where these technologies, so as long as we're feeding AI, what our initial projections were, and that's kind of where we fall short sometimes. You don't keep track of that. It doesn't go in the general ledger. Now we're going to put it, and if we can feed that and then compare it, now we get some real ways to learn how good are we at this? What do we need to do better? Where are our failure points? And so I think there's just so much excitement around the learning that can come from this quickly. Rather, that's a big job for a financial analyst to go back, look at what the records were and what they thought they were going to spend. Oh, we overspent stuff. Now we take that in consideration. Whereas if we can, that whole kind of real part of capital spending, which is such a big part of what we do as finance people, is allocating capital and find better ways to do that and be more efficient at it rather than repeat the same mistakes over and over again. That is really exciting for us. So I'm kind of sticking to the finance world because that's where I live. Maybe AI, maybe I'm too small in my thought, but it's pretty exciting from that standpoint.
You're an early adopter, Steve. You are, aren't you? You get excited about things. And it's great. But I wanted to just really build on that a little bit because I'm, people who have heard me talk about this are sick of it. I'll just say it again. Some years ago, there was a professor named Everett Rogers who came up with this theory called the diffusion of innovation. We are at a point where while AI has been around for a very long time, generative AI, GPT, is truly innovative, right? It's literally like, 9, 12 months old. And innovations of any kind, let alone AI innovations, take a while to diffuse into society. So I'm trying to answer your question in a very conservative way, Devon. And the point is that, we should look forward to the diffusion of this innovation over the next several years. It takes time. Every innovation, when it diffuses into society, has a pattern to it. There are innovators, early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. That sort of sequence of adoption is what we should expect. Where we are right now is at the very bleeding edge of the innovators, right? And I think that to many people for whom innovation is survival, innovation is a business advantage, you will jump in, you will do this. Right? If you're in an industry where innovation is important and this is the type of innovation that will give you that advantage, guess what? You're going to be all over it, right? So innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards, that cycle is going to take 5, 6, 7 years. And we should expect to see changes taking place in the underlying models. We should expect training sets to become larger, to become more specialized. We should expect to see the cost of training go down. We should expect to see new business models emerge off of this technology. We should expect to see new applications built on top of this technology. We should expect to see these models embedded into other applications, right? I think that we've already heard about Microsoft embedding some of this capability into things like Excel and so forth. But there are other industries that are going to embed the virtual assistant that Leon talked about within. Why isn't it part of QuickBooks? It should be, right? And these are things that can be more predictive in nature. And so I think we should expect this kind of capability becoming embedded in the fabric of our lives.
I would agree there with both points, and I'd also like to invoke a little bit of controversy as well. Obviously, with the type of writing that I do, it's always good to have one foot in what I believe to be some form of technology-driven future. Now, with that being the case, I think the difference potentially here with this type of technology is mass adoption. I feel that this is going to increase that lead time between early adopters, laggers, etc. And really, especially as you mentioned before, BC, in terms of the commercial value to the underlying companies who are serving both the chips and both the storage that's required for these type of solutions. Now, I think that because mass adoption is being driven at such a rate, and we're seeing some fairly significant increase in terms of the human literacy values of some of these models coming out, some being open source as well. I think this is really going to drive innovation of AI, increased adoption. In my mind, I'm trying not to talk about a world whereby we all have Neuralink and we walk down the streets and everybody's connected. I don't see that being 5 to 6 years off, but I do see those type of implementations being use cases in the future. Some things that we've discussed, potentially using computer vision, is enabling blind people to interact with their environments using this type of technology. Now, with this being the case, I always liken this type of scenario to the motor vehicle against the horse. Okay. Now, if you had a Ford Model T, or for lack of a better term, another vehicle, you were almost infinitely going to beat a horse in terms of getting to your location, performance, etc. And I think we're in a similar scenario at the moment. The difference being is that the cars couldn't manufacture themselves. what we're getting to the point with AI is that AI can or will be in the future be able to put together versions of itself, software, etc., which again will in turn continue to enhance this cycle. And when you bring all of these factors together, that's why it's very difficult to predict, but I see the line as not being as linear. And Gartner just released, I believe, the AI hype cycle as well, that visual, which is very interesting to see. It's good to see, and if we do have a link to that, I'm sorry I don't have one with me at the moment, but I think it would be very interesting for the audience to see that. But my thoughts as a technologist and as an early adopter and an implementer for organizations is I really see this starting to take flight as a technology.
You know, ubiquity is important and transparency is important. I think technologies like this, I mean, we don't even question the existence of computers, right? I mean, we don't even question the existence of handheld smartphones. You know, it wasn't 15 years ago that, like, you know, these were, you know, open questions that were being asked. Who is going to buy this stuff, right? Is always the question that comes up. But when technology gets embedded, when something like, you know, generative AI, or actually, just to make the point clear and coming back to the original sort of premise, we have AI technologies that are embedded in everyday things that we do today. The fact that we're on a Zoom call with, you know, all kinds of unknown AI technologies sort of being used is lost on us. It's happening, right? You know, we use Siri, we use speech recognition, we use all kinds of things that are part of like AI technology. Similarly, I think generative AI will become ubiquitous. It will become transparent, and we'll take it for granted. I don't know if I'll go so far as to say computers will generate more computers, which will generate even more computers, which will do something unknown to us. But that's, you know, I don't know. We'll see. I'm not that much of an optimist or pessimist, depending on your perspective.
I agree from that perspective. And just to be clear, I think that this is more around the actual underlying code in terms of the generation from that perspective, as opposed to the hardware. But one thing that I didn't touch base on, which I would like to, if it's okay, is legislation and bias. That's something that I'm really hopeful will change across into the future. I think that Steve alluded to it previously as well in terms of the workforce. I think this is just one example where we need to be lobbying for legislations to take place to really not restrict this type of technology. I think that to do so would be at a loss to where we are at this moment in time by adopting this type of technology. But I think we do need to have frameworks in place, because, as I say, mass adoption plus the commercial value, plus, as you mentioned, BC, it being implemented into at least a lot of the leading softwares, if not other areas of our lives already. We really need to put some curtails in around this from a legislation and the bias perspective that the data is trained on as well.
I think I wanted to, I mean, I know we have like rounding the corner here, but I wanted to go back to the beginning and to the topic, which is what can you do today? I'll just say this one more time. Generative AI is really good at Q&A, really good, right? And the large language models that ChatGPT has incorporated are really good. And I would strongly encourage people on the call to shed your biases, to, you know, let the scales fall from your eyes. And any question you have about your everyday finance function, try it out, right? You can just sort of go to ChatGPT, ask the question. You know, you may get an answer that surprises you. You may get an answer that gives you new insights. You may get an answer that causes you to roll your eyes. But there's no way to experience it but to go there and try it out. These questions are they're really good at answering basic questions. And, you know, I'm not sure you can ask very detailed questions about how you're going to become a millionaire, but, you know, simple stuff relating to your financial operations, I think I would strongly encourage you to try it out.
Concur.
Thanks, BC. Well, I know we only have a few minutes left, and I know there's a bunch of questions that have been lined up in the QA, and we only have a few minutes. So I'm sure my content team is going to love me for saying this, but I think we'll write a blog out of all of the questions that you've asked in our chat so we can answer everyone. And I'm sure we'll do some annotation of this webinar itself and include that as well. Steve, Leon, BC, I can't thank you enough for the time that you have dedicated to us today for the chat. I think this has been a really interesting conversation and very thought compelling. I do want to share one slide if everyone doesn't mind. If you are curious to learn a little bit about Centime and how we bring AI into your finance structure today when it comes to AR, AP, cash management, I do encourage you to check out centime.com/demo. If you book a demo with us before September 8th, there is a whole catalog of gifts that we would like to give you. It includes Yetis, air fryers, and so be it. So please check out centime.com/demo. And again, thank you so much, Steve, Leon, and BC for sharing with us all of your insights around AI.
Thank you for keeping us on the straight and narrow, Devin. I think that, you know, you could I could sense from your sort of, you know, body language that you were really worried about this being a runaway train.
I think you guys did a really good job of keeping it within the guardrails, so I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Excellent.
Thank you for having me.
Likewise. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. Bye-bye.